So thank you all for coming. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker who was brave enough to kick things off for us this morning. And our first speaker is Javier Morales, who now lives in Odessa and is an optometrist there. But he has done extensive research into the history of Coyame and the surrounding area, including Presidio County and all the area on both sides of the Rio Grande here. And even though he talks about how families that originated in Coyame have spread all over the U.S. and the world, and he talks about a lot of interesting stories about the early settlers and so forth, he also has a very interesting chapter that captivated our imagination about legends, UFO sightings, sighting of strange creatures, diablitos, and other strange phenomenon that for some reason seem to occur a lot in this region and across the river here in Ojinaga, Coyame area. So Javier Morales is going to come up at this time. Dr. Morales is going to focus on, the chapter from his book that talks about UFO sightings and the paranormal. So Javier, we'll get him started here, and he's got some slides, and we'll get going.
Morning. Do I sound like Noe? That echo?
Echo. Whoa. That's good.
Okay, good morning. Thank you so much for coming and participating in this event. Tell you a little bit about how I come into play in this UFO festival. I was contacted from both ends, from Noe's side, from the UFO sightings that I researched, and from Brad Newton on the festival, because I'm kind of mainly a historian, history buff. And I'll tell you, what I would like to do is for you to, after I get done, that you will have curiosity to go visit Coyame. They just built a brand new hotel there. It's kind of like a Days Inn, a Holiday Inn. And with the information I give you, if you are a UFO enthusiast, you can, with that background, go ahead and go and be able to more easily interview the locals and understand from their point of view how they're different than us Americans. And so this is a picture of the mission that was built there in 1715. Is one of the first missions built out here. And that's actually an artist painted it. And right after that, this was done in 1963. A few years later, it completely went in ruins. So they later restored it. But I thought I'd show you that picture of that. That was one of the engineers that was making the highway through Coyame. In the evenings, he would sit there and do that. This was missing the bottom there. This is a view from the town. There's a little chapel on top there in Coyame. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm an optometrist. That's my job, and I went to school for that. But I have all through my life, I was raised in the culture of Coyame. I was actually born in Chihuahua City. Pretty much lived all my life in Odessa. But, you know, we'd always go, my grandma lived in Coyame, we'd always go there. And, you know, you'd always hear stories when you're at the dinner table, and you're kind of brought up in that culture of hearing different things. So about a little over a decade ago, I decided to put all that on paper, and that's what my book is. Just everything I ever heard. I researched a lot, and nobody had ever done a book over that town, so a lot of the other researchers and other historians, including Sewell Ross University, the Center for Big Bend Studies, told me, you know what, we need to put all that in paper and keep a record of all that. I'll tell you a little bit of how Coyame got started. Back in the 1500s, when the first Spaniards arrived, there's a town called Parral in Santa Barbara. It's on the very south tip of Chihuahua State. That was the furthest north the Spaniards had come. And in there, the reason they stayed there was there's some mines. They found gold and silver. That was one of the main things the Spaniards looked for. And so what they did is when they settled there, they needed some employees, some cheap, free labor. And so they went out and scoured the area for Indians. Well, they made it all the way out here to the Presidio area. And there was a lot of tribes here, and they started kind of taking some of the Indians to work on the mines. And a few years later, they settled some missions here, and the Indians got mad and kicked all the priests out of here. And so eventually, a gentleman by the name of Juan Casviña y Rete, which if you go to Ojinaga, it's their main street, is named after him. He, very wealthy man, he actually was one of the main reasons they built a big chapel in Chihuahua, in the center of Chihuahua. And so anyway, he contacted the vice king, contacted him and said, hey, I heard there's something over there in the area of Presidio. There's something over there. Can you go see what's going on over there? So Casviña Rete comes down through here. I actually have his diary of when he came through here. And so he comes in, and everywhere he found a tribe, he gave orders to build a church. And so that's how Coyame came about. It was 1715 he came through here, and he built about, I guess like 12 churches he ordered for them to build, which are the churches that stand now here in this area. And so he did that, and that's how Coyame came about. The word Coyame is not an English word, it's not a Spanish word, it's an Indian word. When they arrived at that area, the chief of the tribe, his name was Chief Coyame. And so and the locals say it's Coyame, but in Spanish it's Coyame. Coyame, if you say it in English. And so, anyway, the name of the town is originally it was named after the chief of the tribe, Chief Coyame, and it was the tribe of the Cholones. That's who the tribe was. So they built this church, beautiful church, everybody's happy. A lot of settlers started coming into this area, and about 10 years later, some famous tribe called the Apaches come down to this area and say, you don't belong here. And they burned all the churches, killed most of the settlers, everybody ran back south, and for many years it was abandoned. Nobody could come out here. The Spanish cavalry would come through here and try to get control of this area, but it didn't, you know. And eventually, they were able to push them as far as kind of the Odessa area. They pushed the Apache and towards kind of the central New Mexico area. They pushed it back. And so people came back and settled this area. Okay? But if you go to Coyame, the original mission is still there. They restored it exactly how it was in 1715. When they were restoring it, they found the armor of the priest that was living there when the Apaches killed everybody, that he was buried in the ground of the church. And the attire of the Spanish guard, just like you see in this picture, was in the ground. It was very neat. That was in the 70s. They found that. They went ahead and reburied him. But when they killed him, the Spanish cavalry came back and buried the priest and his personal guard in the ground of the mission. So if you ever go to Coyame, you'll love to see that mission restored completely how it was back in 1750. Let me tell you a little bit about the Coyame people. Obviously, with the Spanish Inquisition, the majority were Catholic. If you weren't Catholic, you were kind of in trouble with the church. So it was kind of forced on them, the religion. The Indian ancestry is very big because the Spanish soldiers that arrived married the Indian women. And so that's how you become the Mexican race. And so Coyame is a huge Indian ancestry. The two cultures clashed, and you have a lot of the Spanish ways and Indian ways too. So you'll see that a lot in like their medicinal, their beliefs, their one of the things I'll talk about later is the owl. Both the cultures believe the owl is kind of a bad thing. Living out here, there was no Home Depots, no Walmarts, nothing. I mean, today I was running late because I didn't gas up from Martha. So you have to really plan to actually live here and survive. You can imagine in the 1700s how incredibly isolated this area was. You couldn't call 911. That made it a really, really tough people to live out here hundreds of years, because I'm a descendant of one of those soldiers that arrived in 1715. So you can imagine we're here for a reason, Little government, people had to fend for themselves, and that kind of makes you, all that starts combining and together to make you a very unique person that lives out here in the frontier. Tell you a little bit, last night we were at an event in Marfa, and some of the locals were talking to me, and a lot of people already know about Coyame, and so I'm going to kind of educate you on what the town is known for. As you know, the first cattle, the first ranchers arrived in Parral in the southern part of Chihuahua, and so that was in 1500, and so you can see how far back the ranching roots go. That was the first ranchers, first cattle arrived in that part of Chihuahua. So that kind of then migrates towards, southwest United States. And so that there's still many, many huge ranches in that area of Coyame. Agriculture, they do have clay soil, so they have very good agriculture for farming there. And also making adobe is very good soil for that. Also, the Indian, when the Spanish arrived, they had their own liquor, and it's called sotol. Soto, if you say it in English, is sotol. And it comes from a desert plant, and the Indian would make, ferment it and make their own alcoholic drink. And when the Spanish arrived, they went ahead and made it more pure. They brought their distilleries and they made it more pure. This became very popular in Coyame when the Prohibition, because the border was very close to bringing, alcohol was brought in from Canada and from the Virgin Islands area and Mexico. So Sotol made very many people very wealthy in Coyame. If you had a distillery, very wealthy. Okay. Also in Coyame, the reason the tribe settled there is there's some natural springs. There's they call it the eye. And it comes, water comes out of this rock, and it's been coming out for hundreds of years. And so, when you live in the desert, water is the most important thing to survive out here. So that's why the tribe settled there, and eventually the people from Coyame settled there from that water. And it's still there now, and they have some beautiful natural spring swimming pools that you can go and bathe in, and it's from that water that comes out of the rock just into the swimming pools. As you know, in 1910, for many hundreds of years of the Spanish clashing with the Indians, eventually the people got tired of it, and that's when they wanted to overthrow a dictator, and which is called the Mexican Revolution in 1910. It lasted for 10 years. Well, the start of the revolution was in Coyame, and so it's very, very popular because nowadays, as you know, Susan Martinez, the governor of New Mexico, is a descendant of the man that started the Mexican Revolution in Coyame. And so they've invited her a couple of years, and they started doing a big event in Coyame of the reenactments of the revolution. And so it goes to show you that the Coyame people were very, very politically involved. And that's very important how, even though they were isolated in little government, they were very politically involved in the whole nation to start a revolution in their town. Also, it's, you can't talk about this area without talking about the Apache and the influence the Apache had. If you were there at the Fort Leaton, the reason that fort is wall is so high is because of the Apache attacks. And so the single event that ended the Apache Wars and created the expansion of America into this area. Before that, nobody would come out here. If you did, you died. And so the single most event that ended that and made people start moving to this area, the railroad coming and everything, was Chief Victorio. He was the Apache chief. He was killed in Coyame by the Mexican cavalry. That ended the Apache. He was Geronimo's chief. So that ended the Apache wars, the Apache unrest out here, and it created an incredible expansion in the 1880s of this area. You can actually go visit the site where there's a lot of arrowheads, and they dumped, for you treasure hunters out here, he dumped all his gold he had stolen into the lake where they killed him, right next to Coyame. So somebody with some diving gear goes out there, they'll find millions of dollars in gold that were thrown into during the battle. He threw all his gold into the lake. Also, there's another plant, desert plant, that was that was called Candelilla wax. It's you can still see it now in this area. But anyway, it was mainly cultivated in Coyame. That was smuggled into the United States because that wax was used in the military to do a lot of during the wars, World War I, World War II. It was used to do lining on airplane airplane wings, on the tarps they used it for candles. So that was protected by the Mexican government, and there was a limit on how much you can cultivate. Well, on the border here, if you know there's Candelaria, that's what got its name. People just cross it over the border and sell it for 5 times what the government was paying in Mexico. So Coyame is also known for that. Some of the people dedicated their whole career, their whole lives to cultivating it, that if you go to the cemetery in Coyame, they plant, the families plant Candelilla plants all the way around their tomb to show that that's what they lived from. Also, there's some real famous caves. I got to visit them when they first opened them. And what's interesting, we went into a very corner of the caves, and in the very back corner where you can't really get back in there was a little picture of a saint that was from hundreds of years ago. So I don't know if Indians were going in there, or it's very interesting, but that's real famous in Coyame. And they're very, they used to, you had to go in a rope, they'd bring you in a rope with a candle. And now they've made it very touristy with guides and sidewalks in there. Very well known for that also, Coyame. This is real important for the UFO aspect of what we're talking about. In the census I found in the early 1900s, there was a mine in Coyame, and the names of the people were not Spanish. They were Greek and Arab, the workers. Very interesting to me. And that mine, I think, was uranium they were pulling out of there, and besides the silver. And as of 5 years ago, I think, the mayor of Coyame was telling me that there's another Canadian mine that just opened there, and it possibly could be uranium. So I don't know if there's a connection between the UFO sightings of that area with their uranium. I don't know. That's something, I'm going to give you a lot of questions more than answers today with what I've researched. But if we have the UFO researchers in here, that'd be something to make note of, that maybe they're visiting that area because of their uranium in Coyame. As you can see, this is kind of what going into the Coyame, it's in a big valley. You can see how isolated and how hard it would be to travel back in the old days. Even today, it's hard. But imagine in the old days on horseback, how harsh that would be. And, to travel that type of harsh environment. All right, well, let's get to the part of. Remember, I researched as a historian. I didn't research it for the UFO, but in the hundreds of people or thousands of people I interviewed, I did it on tape, and this always came up about Coyame, that there's a lot of paranormal activity. So I'm going to give you the 2 aspects. I'm going to tell you the main cases people over and over and over told me about, and that multiple people saw, and then I'm going to also give you the cultural paranormal of the Coyame, what culturally people see as abnormal things in the town. Anytime you have a question, make sure to stop me.
Okay, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
I'm trying to picture, I don't know Mexico that well, I'm trying to picture where Coyame is. Is
Oh, I'm
it
sorry, yes. It's just like 45 minutes across the border.
from here?
Yes, and so it would be between, it's pretty much almost between Chihuahua City and Presidio.
Oh.
It's that main highway.
Oh.
They built a new highway to make it, because if you look at that picture, you can imagine the highway was going through that mountain there, that
Oh.
left side mountain. And so it's very dangerous. You're going like 5 miles an hour, which is beautiful, but it's also dangerous. So one of the governors a few years ago built a highway to go around that area. So it's just pretty much a straightaway, but you kind of go around Coyame. You don't go through Coyame anymore.
Oh.
So to go to Coyame, you have to go straight to the old highway. And what's kind of creepy is when you get to the very top of that, there's a rest area, and you can go down there and look at the Conscious River. It's beautiful. But if you look to the other side, there's a bunch of cars down there too. But anyway, it's very beautiful. And like I said, they have a Days Inn there, a very modern hotel. A beautiful little town. Everybody's great. They're all the locals. All right, let's start with the 1960 Ramirez family incident. This incident was, like I remember, the ones I picked were because many people saw this from the town. The town maybe had 2,000 people during all these incidents. And so now it's not as populated. A lot of people have migrated to the United States, but this one here, you know how the beautiful desert summer afternoons, cool breeze, everybody's outside, and this huge disc that took almost the whole entire sky, hovered over the church, the mission I was telling you about, right over the church. And it was very silent. Nobody heard any noise from and remember, look at the time period this is, okay? Very few people from this village knew about airplanes in the 1960s. They're mainly ranching, agriculture, there living, not going out to the big cities or anything. So, this huge disc that took almost the entire sky, in the evening when everybody's sitting outside, everybody saw it in the town that was sitting outside, and the lights were so bright. The person that told me the story, he was the head of the household, he says, I thought the world was going to end. Remember that culturally, they're Catholic, and all that Indian ancestry, that plays into how they see the world. They don't think UFO, they don't think something from another planet. They think culturally, this is the end of the world. Because they said the lights were so bright they couldn't see the object, what it looked like, because the lights were so bright, and it just as it came down on top of the town, it got bigger and bigger and bigger, the object, as it was hovering over the church. And so Mr. Ramirez said he grabbed all his young kids, and all the kids, remember, I interviewed all the kids, and ran into the house and started praying the rosary because they said the world was going to end. Because the light was so intense. And they just started praying, and nothing happened. And when they came back outside, pitch black, huge. In Coyame, before they had electricity, I remember when I go as a kid, you go there and your eyes are adapted to the city, and you go there and God almighty, thousands of stars, incredible sky. And that's how it did. When they went back outside, the stars were there, nothing ever came of it. But a lot of people collaborated and said it was the late 60s, early 70s. So it seems to be like that time period, there was a lot of stuff going on. Here's another late 60s, early 70s account. Mr. Arroyo was in Coyame. The town has 2 cemeteries. It has one cemetery, the original cemetery, and that was not used after the great influenza epidemic, 1917. So they stopped burying people there and made a new cemetery. Well, another huge disc came over the town, hovered over that cemetery. Mr. Arroyo was probably 18 years old. He saw it, and he wasn't afraid. He ran towards it, and he stood under it, looking at it, and he said, didn't make any sound, and he started getting rocks and throwing rocks at it, just to see what would happen. I'm 17, 18-year-old, not afraid of anything bulletproof. And so he said he threw rocks at it, and the rocks would not come back down. When he would throw them at it, they wouldn't come back down. They just went straight up, the rocks he threw. And so he said it slowly kept moving away from him until he couldn't see it anymore. And he had some friends with him, and all the friends said they saw the same thing. And that was in 1968. Here's the two other gentlemen that their story is they had some, the parents had sent them out. They had rounded up some cattle that they were going to take to market. So when they had all the cattle together, they sent them out to keep an eye on the cattle the night before they were going to take the cattle out. And it also was the late 60s, early 70s. And I give you the name of that because that's where they said the area was. That's what they called the area, Tanque de Goya. That's what they called the area where it happened. And what they said is they were there camping, watching the cattle. They weren't supposed to go to sleep. Their parents told their dads told them they couldn't go to sleep. They had to keep an eye on the cattle. And when they were there, they saw a huge disc coming towards them. And they were teenagers, and so as the disc came towards them, these guys got afraid, became very afraid. They weren't like the other guy that threw rocks at it. They got very afraid. And they said the light came right over them, a huge blinding light, and they grabbed their jackets and covered themselves and started crying because they didn't know what to do. It was so scary to them. And the disc stayed over them, no sound also, and they both started crying, yelling for their parents, and then the light went away, and they looked over, and it was gone. And so these people, all of these people, you have to keep in mind, they don't talk about this openly because they're afraid that people are going to think they're crazy. People are going to think they're making this up, they want attention, so nobody openly talks about that. These people told me these stories, and it was a one-on-one with a video camera when I was interviewing them for my book. And 99% of stuff we were talking about was not UFOs, but they would just, at the end of the interview, anything else you want to add? And they would say, well, this was kind of weird, I'll just tell you. And but it wasn't, they don't openly talk about this. And like I said, that's why I mentioned earlier who these people are, very, very Catholic. And can't be very Catholic and believe in things like that. But they saw them, I witnessed all that. This is one thing my mom and my grandma saw. And let me tell you, my grandma was a very hardcore Catholic. She even wears a little veil on her head to go to church. I mean, real old school Catholic. And you're not supposed to believe in things like ghosts and UFOs and things like that. So my mom told me this story many, many times as we were little. And for this festival, I went in and interviewed my mom again. She's in her mid-60s, and my grandma's 100 years old. And what happened to them is remember I told you about the eye, the water eye, that water comes out of the rock? Well, what they did in the 40s, so people wouldn't have to build wells in each one of the houses, they made a big canal that went all the way around the town. And so that water would go in this canal and go all over the town. Everybody had fresh water. You didn't have to go all the way to the rock where the water was and get a pail and bring it to your house. So my grandma, it was about midnight, and she said, we need to go get a pail of water from the canal, which was about 5 blocks away, so we can have water for the morning, for breakfast. So my mom was about 8, 9 years old. And so they said, hurry, let's go get some water. And so my grandma was walking with a pail of water, and full moon, and my mom's trying to catch her, and as she's going, she sees a man-looking figure that kind of looked like his head was kind of weird. And it was floating about 1 to 2 feet off the ground, and completely still, not moving arms like a walking person, and just hovering and moving forward towards the canal they were going. So my mom's walking real fast behind my grandma, and you know, my grandma would probably be in her 30s, and she looks over and sees them, and she stops and says, "That's weird. It looks like a man, but he's not touching the ground. He's just hovering, and his arms aren't moving or anything. He's just completely still and just hovering forward, and his head looks weird." And so my grandma turns over and says, "Hurry up, you know, hurry up, we're almost to the canal." And then my mom noticed that he was, in the direction he was coming to the canal where they were going. And it kind of scared her, so she says, "Mom, look at that weird man over there." And my grandma looks over and sees him, and she confirms she saw him. And she says, she stops, and the guy took of that object, that humanoid looking thing is coming, still floating towards them. And my grandma immediately turns around, grabs my mom's hand, and goes right back home. She did not want to go to the canal. And it's weird, you know. And then I know, after I researched that, I know there's a lot of accounts, especially in Mexico, of humanoid floating, hovering things, you know. So I don't know what that was. And so they went back, and my mom said she kept looking back, and my grandma was walking, and he completely went all the way to the water canal. And so from then on, my grandma never went at night to get water. She was very afraid. And so never talked about it to anybody. When I talked to grandma, I said, "Grandma, is this?" And she said, "Yes, but we don't talk about those things. You know, that's weird stuff you're not supposed to talk about." Okay, and in the famous 1974, Noe and Mr. Rubin will talk to you about this in real detail, but every single person that lived there in 1974 knows about this event. Will they admit it and tell you on record? Probably not. But a lot of people, most of the people, I was almost a year old and we were living in Chihuahua City. My mom was taken to Chihuahua to have so I could be born in a hospital, because we were living in Coyame and then we went to Chihuahua. And then from Chihuahua we went to Odessa. But my mom remembers that she wasn't in Coyame, but she remembers that her brother called her, and I was like 9 months old, and said, "This is weird. Let me tell you what happened here in Coyame." And everybody was there at the site. So I won't give you too many details about that. Mr. Noe, they're the experts in that. I'm not. I'm just, everybody would bring this up when I interviewed them over my book. So what I wanted to do with my part of it was to tell you what Coyame is, where is it, about the people. And so when he talks about it, you'll put the two together. You won't be thinking, what is this random place he's talking about? The crash site is El Saucito Ranch, which was purchased by Herminio Ramirez, and it was a sotol en Candelilla Ranch. There's no agriculture, no ranching. It was solely purchased for that. Why? Because they had a lot of sotol plants and a lot of Candelilla wax plants. So if you ever get to go, I think his grandson owns it now. If you ever get to go to Coyame and want to go see the crash site, when you're there and you look at the terrain, that'll come to your mind. Why does somebody put a ranch here? It's just real rocky and deserty. That's why Mr. Herminio became he had one of the first cars in the state of Chihuahua. You know, when the first car, Henry Ford's car, came out, so you can see how wealthy he was back then. And so that's the reason. You know, that's the ranch where it happened, and that's where it happened. That's if you get to go there, you'll know the terrain and what the history of that area. There's a person that's still living that I think saw the whole thing. And when I interviewed him, I said, "You've got to tell me. I'm doing this book." He said, "Sure, I'll tell you." Because a lot of people have come to ask me, "You think I'd be crazy to tell them what I've seen?" Those Americans have come, Mexican authorities, Mexican government has come. I did not see a thing. It was one of the ranch hands that lived on the ranch. But to me, he says, that's true, maybe, you know. But he said, he's the elderly man. He said, "I'm not going to say anything to anybody. I'm afraid to talk about it." And so many of the local police were there at the site the next morning. everybody that had curiosity went to go look at it. You know, there's been many airplane crashes in Coyame. I don't know what happens there, why there's so many crashes. There's one guy that I put in my book that actually crashed there in his plane, an American, and the Coyame people took him out of the plane, took him to the little clinic there, healed him up for a few days, saved his life, and from then on, every Christmas, he would come in his plane and give gifts to the town. We were so appreciative they saved his life. So there's been many airplane wrecks. So there's something going on in there, in that area that many planes were crashing. So I'm going to touch you a little bit about the abnormal, unexplained phenomena that culturally too are part of Coyame. I remember as a kid when you would see a white owl, everybody would run in their house. Oh my God, there's a lechuza, that's what they call the white owl. And it's culturally in both Spanish and Indian culture. The white owl is bad news. And it was always seemed like when we would see them, they would be standing up on a tree or a telephone pole or something looking down at us. That white owl, and it was like, culturally it meant it was a witch disguised as an owl. Well, in one of the interviews, a guy said he was upset because this owl kept following him with these tough ranchers. He pulled out his 30-06 rifle, turns around and shoots the owl right in the eyeball and kills it. Well, the next morning, apparently, there was an elderly lady that was in her bed, dead from a gunshot wound to the eyeball. Unexplained weird stuff. So anyway, white owls are bad news. Okay? Also, almost everybody that lived in Coyame has seen this, including my parents and my grandma and everybody, my uncles, everybody has seen this. There's these huge balls of fire that fly through the sky. People have also seen them where they are in somebody's home, like the whole house is lit up, and then it comes out of the house and then flies off. And you know, scientifically, people have tried to explain it, and they say it's a swarm of fireflies. But I mean, it's a huge ball of fire. You know, these tough ranchers that aren't afraid of anything, they get their rifles out, they shoot at it too, and nothing's ever happened. When they fly over cattle and horses, they know, they start making weird sounds, and you know, dogs start barking at these balls of fire, and very, very common in Coyame. I never saw any, but my mom says she would see them all the time, and almost 90% of the people lived in Coyame for a few years saw these balls of fire, and they did not know what they were. So this is real common. I make fun of this. My mom gets mad at me because I'm not supposed to make fun of Mexican culture, but apparently this is called the evil eye. So let's say I'm looking at a real cute baby, and I'm like, God, that baby's so cute. Look at his cheeks, and you don't touch the baby, you could give him the evil eye. So you transmit bad energy from your eye to the baby, and you make the baby sick. Okay? So I don't believe in it, but I always tease my mom about it. She gets mad because she truly believes in the evil eye. And so I would see this all the time. When something like that happened, a baby would start crying and not feeling good. So, oh God, you know what? You didn't touch the baby. Now you gave him the evil eye. So they would rub an egg on the baby and pray on him, and then he would get better. Okay? So that's real common in Coyame. We would see that all the time. And the evil eye.
They didn't teach you about that in optometry school?
Nope, they didn't teach me that in optometry school. Okay, this is another one. This is more with our Aztec culture that we inherited. I remember as a kid, you would hear that with other cousins would talk about it, that in the creek of Coyame, they would hear a lady crying, and she would be yelling, my children, you know, and you would see her just roaming the creek of Coyame. And apparently what happened is she had a lover, a man she loved, and she had children, and the man said, I won't marry you because you have kids. And so she drowns her 3 kids to marry this man or get together with this man, and then the man doesn't marry her. And so she killed herself. And so she goes to heaven, and then God says, what'd you do to your kids? You know, you shouldn't have done that. So now you're going to roam the earth trying to find your kids, and you'll never come to heaven. And so that's the Coyame version, but through the Aztec culture, we see that as a omen of one of the Aztecs gods crying over her children, which are the Aztecs, that the Spanish were coming and eradicate the whole race. And that's why she was crying, my children. She was crying over her Indian children. But anyway, that was very common. It was very scary stuff when I was a kid, because we'd be in bed and, oh God, did you hear that? Oh, it's the crying lady, La Llorona. And you get scared as a kid. Oh my God, I don't want to go to the creek at night and see La Llorona. That's me at Copper Canyon, 4,000 feet up on this, crawling on a rock. Anybody have any questions? Does this kind of educate you about Coyame and yes, ma'am?
Well, I'm just curious, why do you think that Coyame was interesting to the aliens? I mean, was it the uranium that was in the area, or was there water, or what was it that attracted them to that particular small place?
Well, that's what I was wondering, that you know, not being a UFO expert, you know, I think it's the uranium there. Also, the just kind of an isolated place with no people too. You know, it's very isolated, no people out there. Compared to like Mexico City, for example, where there's more people. I don't know. Like I said, I'm giving you more questions and answers. But the fact is, if I could probably do a book, and that's for my UFO friends out here. You could probably do a book and interviewing people. If you can get through that barrier, that cultural barrier, people will open up and tell you everything they've ever seen. And that could be a whole book in itself, Coyame UFOs. Because there is a lot, like I said, my whole reason for the book was not UFOs, but it kept coming up at the end of the interview. Anything else you want to add? Oh yeah, this was weird, I saw this. And so people have been, if you lived in there, you've for years been seeing weird stuff there in Coyame. And the balls of fire, I don't know, those are, you know, UFOs or not.
Any rumors of people being abducted or animals?
Well, that'd be hard to have somebody admit that.
Oh.
If they're just embarrassed to say that they saw a UFO, can you imagine the saying they were abducted? That would be really hard to. You have to have a lot of really good relationship with that person. Having, you know, they're very old school people. You know, they're very old school Mexicans in Coyame.
What about animal mutilations on the ranches? Was there ever any of that, or did they ever?
Nobody ever mentioned anything. But that, since there is a lot of ranching out there, that would be something interesting to see. You know, to talk to people about. Yeah, that's a big. You know, these people. It would be interesting to talk to them. You know, of what, you know. And to them, it's normal seeing weird stuff. If you've been, you know. Like my mom, all the stuff she shared with me, she saw it as normal. Seeing balls of fire all the time. It was normal there, you know. And
yeah.
So a lot of times they would associate that with witches too. They didn't know how to associate it, but they thought maybe it was witches.
Is this still going on now, 50 years later?
I don't know. Since we moved our grandma, she got Alzheimer's. We moved her to Odessa a few decades now. We don't go to Coyame anymore like we used to. We used to go all the time, and so I even spent summers there.
Oh.
And so it's a beautiful little town and real quiet. It kind of reminds me of Shafter, Texas.
Oh.
It's in a little valley like that, real quiet. People leave their windows and doors open, and real nice place. And so I never saw any weird stuff, but I never did look up. I never looked up at the sky as a kid, you know. And so, but yeah, I haven't gone. There's a very small population now compared to the old days. And so a lot of people are retiring there that were from there. They're going back and building American homes there, retiring in Coyame. Any other questions? Hope you enjoyed it, and now we're going to give you the real experts in UFO stuff, and we thank you for being so attentive and listening. Thank you.